a quiet, hypnotic sleep story set in a forgotten medieval village where time ticks gently back to life. Settle in now. Close your eyes. Feel the hush begin, because our story tonight begins in a place where time once stopped, far beyond the rolling moors. Past the lavender fields and sleepy woodlands lies a village tucked between two hills, so small and so still that even the wind forgets to whisper there. Its name, long ago, was Bell Hollow. And though its name has faded from most maps, you might still feel it in the quiet ticking of your own breath. Soft, slow, steady. Just like the way the hours once moved there. In the heart of Bell Hollow stood a clock tower, not grand, not tall, just quiet. Its wood, weathered by centuries of rain and sun, leaned ever so slightly, as if it, too, had grown tired of standing. Once, long ago, the clock had chimed each hour with a tone so rich and low that birds would fall still, and people would close their eyes just to feel it hum through their ribs. But now the tower slept. The bell was rusted, the gears forgotten, and the hands still frozen at midnight, or perhaps noon. It was hard to tell, for time had given up its hold in Bell Hollow. The villagers had grown used to the silence. Children no longer asked what the tower was for. Elders simply smiled, as if remembering a song they no longer needed to sing. They lived by the sun, by the warmth of bread ovens, and the long shadows of the linden trees. Time, in Bell Hollow, was felt in the bones, not watched on a face. But all of that was about to change, because on a morning dusted in pale golden fog, a stranger came walking down the old road. He wore a long coat, patched at the elbows, and carried a box beneath one arm, the kind of box that looked like it belonged to another century, and his eyes, soft brown and weather-creased, held the calm of someone who had counted many seconds and cherished each one. His name was Aurelian, and he was a watchmaker. He did not come with questions. He did not speak loudly. He did not carry scrolls or commands. He simply arrived, walked to the tower, placed a hand on its worn wooden door, and whispered, "You are not broken, you are resting." Then he sat at the base of the tower, opened his box, and began to listen. What he heard was not silence, not truly. He heard time, buried deep inside the tower's bones. Faint ticks, groans of metal, the echo of years stacked like dust between the gears. Most would have missed it, but not Aurelian. He had spent his whole life listening to lost time, and this tower, it was not dead, only forgotten. The villagers were curious. Of course, they peered from windows, peeked around corners, watched him from behind baskets of bread and half-knitted shawls. But he asked nothing of them. He spoke only to the tower, and it began to respond. On the third day, he removed the lower hatch and gently oiled the first gear. It sighed, not loudly, but in relief, like a joint finally stretching after centuries of stillness. On the fourth day, he cleared the dust from the pendulum well, polished it until it caught a single beam of sunlight, and swung once, just once, then rested again. On the fifth day, he replaced a spring, one so delicate, so slender and curved, that it looked more like a hair from a silver fox than a piece of metal. He held it up to the light and whispered, "You held too much, for too long." And when he placed it into its cradle, the tower gave the softest of clicks, not loud, not proud, just right. The villagers began to gather in the early mornings, just after tea and before market. They said little, only stood near the tower, as if remembering a lullaby. Children began to sketch its shape in dirt. Elders hummed old tunes they thought they had forgotten. Time, it seemed, was not just in the tower. It had been asleep in them too. And Aurelian, he never rushed. He moved like a man who had learned to let time unfold itself, like a petal in the sun, like steam from a mug, like breath at the edge of sleep. He wound no gears before they were ready. He polished no dial that resisted touch. He simply waited until the tower asked. And each night, as the stars blinked open like quiet lanterns, he would close his little wooden box, lean back against the tower's stones, and look up at the moon. And to no one in particular, He would whisper, "Everything returns when the silence is kind." Asterisk, the hush deepens. Memories awaken, and the first chime prepares to return. The days in Bell Hollow became quieter, but not with stillness. With listening, there was a difference. Stillness is the absence of sound, but listening, it is the welcoming of it. And now, Bell Hollow was listening. Children tiptoed past the tower, ears tilted like curious birds. They swore they could hear whispers beneath the floorboards. Little hiccups of time that felt like footsteps in a dream. The baker paused needing just a moment longer each morning to watch the watchmaker clean the hour ring, rubbing it so gently as if it were made of silk, not brass. And a midwife, who had not entered the tower since she was a girl, stood beneath its windows and closed her eyes. She remembered then the sound of the chime echoing through her mother's shawl. The chime. It had not rung in decades, perhaps longer. Its rope was frayed, its clapper rusted, its weight uncertain, but still it hung, waiting, like a breath held just behind the teeth. And Aurelian, he never rushed, he merely whispered to the chime, as he did to the gears, "When you are ready, I'll be listening." On the sixth day, he brought out a small wooden case. Inside it, soft cloth and tiny brushes like those used for painting butterflies. He knelt at the foot of the bell and began to clean it, not with vigor, but with reverence. Every touch was a lullaby. That afternoon, the clock hands moved, not far, not fast, but they moved, a minute's width, perhaps less. The children gasped, the elders smiled, and Aurelian, he nodded once, as though the tower had just said hello. On the seventh day, the wind changed. It smelled of something older. Worn leather, damp stone, memories. And with it came an old woman from the far end of the village. Her name was Issel, and she was once the clockkeeper's daughter. She walked slowly, leaned on a stick carved with notches. Each notch was a bell, not of metal, but of time. Her eyes, pale and soft as smoke, welled when she saw the tower. "He always said it would speak again," she whispered, and Aurelian nodded. It never stopped. It only needed someone to listen. She sat beside him, and they worked in silence. He handed her a gear. She cleaned it. He passed her a pendulum rod. She traced it with her fingers, as if remembering its lull. Together, they waited for the right moment, and on the eighth day, as mist clung to the grass and birds flew in slow circles overhead, Isolde placed her hand on the chime's rope. Aurelian did not guide her. He simply stepped back. The villagers gathered in a hush. No one spoke. Even the breeze stilled. Isolde closed her eyes, breathed in, and pulled. The chime rang once, just once, but it was enough. The note rolled out slowly, like honey over stone. Not sharp, not loud. Just deep, warm, true. It reached into cottages, through cellars, beneath floorboards. It rattled loose old laughter, forgotten lullabies, and names carved into trees behind the schoolhouse. In one corner of the square, a child looked up and said, "The sky heard it too." And somewhere deep in the tower, a gear clicked. Time had remembered itself. Aurelian closed his wooden box that night and looked up at the moon. He whispered, "Every tick is a kindness. Every chime is a return." And beneath him, the tower breathed. Asterisk, the village awakens gently, 2 times returned, finds peace in its rhythm. After the bell's first chime, something shifted in Bell Hollow. Not suddenly, not loudly, but like a stream thawing under winter ice. Quiet, persistent, gentle. The villagers began waking slightly earlier, not from alarm, not from obligation, but from a feeling that something important was breathing again. Children started playing near the tower steps. They chalked numbers onto the stones. They took turns pretending to be the bell, with voices low and deep, booning. Their giggles filled the hollow like birdsong. The baker began measuring his rise time by the sunlight on the tower's face. He swore his bread had grown lighter, and perhaps it had, because peace, after all, makes the flower rise. Better. The seamstress began stitching little time marks into the cuffs of her tunics. Tiny dots, in circles, one for each hour. "Just for fun," she said. But her fingers lingered just a little longer on the 11th stitch. the one her grandmother used to call the wish hour. In quiet corners, old diaries re-emerged, letters were reread, birthdates remembered. One man cleaned his father's watch, even though it no longer ticked. "It feels right," he whispered to no one. At the tower, Aurelian continued his work. He did not mark the days. He did not write reports. He simply listened to what each piece needed. Some days, he replaced a single bolt. Other days, he simply polished the face of the dial until it reflected the clouds. And some days, he did nothing at all but sit, because even time, he believed, needs stillness. Isolde visited often. She brought candied figs, old stories, and a deep silence that felt like a hug made of wool. They rarely spoke. They did not need to. One day, as birds circled above the tower's spire, Aurelian heard something different. A clicking. Not sharp, not urgent, but eager, like a child tapping their toes. Before a dance, he climbed the stairs and placed his ear to the heart of the mechanism. "Ah," he said, "you're ready for the pendulum." The pendulum had always been the soul. It did not tick, it did not chime, it simply moved back and forth. A heartbeat for the tower. He lifted it with both hands, as though carrying a sleeping bird, and gently placed it into its housing. It did not start on its own, so he waited, and after a while, the village awakens gently 2 times returned, finds peace in its rhythm. After the bell's first chime, something shifted in Bell Hollow, not suddenly, not loudly, but like a stream thawing under winter ice, quiet, persistent, gentle. The villagers began waking slightly earlier, not from alarm, not from obligation, but from a feeling that something important was breathing again. Children started playing near the tower steps. They chalked numbers onto the stones. They took turns pretending to be the bell with voices low and deep. Boonan, boonan. Their giggles filled the hollow like birdsong. The baker began measuring his rise time. By the sunlight on the tower's face, he swore his bread had grown lighter, and perhaps it had, because peace, after all, makes the flour rise better. The seamstress began stitching little time marks into the cuffs of her tunics. Tiny dots in circles, one for each hour, just for fun, she said. But her fingers lingered just a little longer on the 11th stitch, the one her grandmother used to call the wish hour. In quiet corners, old diaries re-emerged. Letters were reread. Birthdates remembered. One man cleaned his father's watch, even though it no longer ticked. "It feels right," he whispered to no one. At the tower, Aurelian continued his work. He did not mark the days. He did not write reports. He simply listened to what each piece needed. Some days, he replaced a single bolt. Other days, he simply polished the face of the dial until it reflected the clouds. And some days, he did nothing at all but sit, because even time, he believed, needs stillness. Isolde visited often. She brought candied figs, old stories, and a deep silence that felt like a hug made of wool. They rarely spoke. They did not need to. One day, as birds circled above the tower's spire, Aurelian heard something different. A clicking, not sharp, not urgent, but eager, like a child tapping their toes. Before a dance, he climbed the stairs and placed his ear to the heart of the mechanism. "Ah," he said, "you're ready for the pendulum." The pendulum had always been the soul. It did not tick. It did not chime. It simply moved back and forth. A heartbeat for the tower. He lifted it with both hands, as though carrying a sleeping bird, and gently placed it into its housing. It did not start on its own, so he waited, and after a while, as the sun drifted behind the hills, it moved, once, twice, and then, like breath, remembering breath again, back, forth, soft, sure. From outside, the villagers heard it, not with their ears, but in their chests, a tiny rhythm that soothed the bones, like a lullaby from the floorboards. That night, no one spoke of it, no one gathered. Instead, each person felt the hush of rhythm settling in, and they slept the deepest sleep they had known in years. The next morning, a girl named Lyra placed a daisy on the tower steps. She did not know why, but her hands felt warm doing it, and far above, the bell waited. Not for permission, not for applause. The pendulum swings, the village listens, and the bell waits for the hour that matters most. The pendulum had swung through the night, back, forth, a soft metallic whisper, like the sound of wind slipping through a silver ring. It did not count time. It reminded the world that time still wanted to be felt. In the morning, dew clung to cobblestones like tiny glass clocks, each drop shimmering with its own quiet hour. Aurelian opened the tower's door and paused. He stood in stillness, watching the village stretch and yawn into day. He did not need to wind the gears today. The tower was doing that on its own, like a bird remembering how to fly. Down in the square, a group of children had gathered with stones and sticks. They had made their own sundial. It was crooked, slightly off-center, but filled with joy. Every hour, they would run to it and call out guesses. This is the hour of lemonade. No, this is the hour of ladybugs. I think it's the nap o'clock. And the adults let them play, because deep down, they too had begun to believe that time was not just for clocks, it was also for feeling. The village bell had not rung again, not yet, and that was all right. Some things returned slowly, like trust, like spring, like light after a long fog. Isolda had begun knitting again. Not shawls or hats, but something different. Small circular patches, one for each chime she remembered. She placed them on her windowsill where the wind could touch them. And some said, on certain mornings, they spun gently, in rhythm with the tower. The blacksmith mended an old weather vane in the shape of a rooster. He said he had dreamed of the clock striking 12, and the rooster crowing at the exact same moment. So he hung the vane on top of his roof, facing the tower, just in case, he said. And people smiled, because belief, even quiet belief, was blooming again. Aurelian spent the afternoon adjusting the tension spring. It was delicate work, no room for rush, no tolerance for force. He moved like a man tuning a lullaby, each adjustment bringing the chime closer to readiness. He ran his finger along the inside of the bell's rim. It sang, barely above a whisper. Not yet, he said to it. But, soon, that evening, a light rain fell, soft, barely enough to soak the earth. The streets glistened like silver. And in the tower, the tick of the pendulum sounded louder in the damp, more certain, like a heartbeat finding its confidence. Aurelian stood at the tower window, watching the glow of hearts. Through the mist, he could feel it, the approach of the hour, the one that mattered, the one that would call not just the bell, but the people, not to work, not to worry, but to remember. He whispered to the tower, hold your voice one night longer. Let them rest before they remember. The tower seemed to agree. Its gears quieted, the hands on the face paused. The hush deepened. That night, dreams came thick and golden. People dreamt of chimes they had not heard since childhood. Some dreamt of clocks made of clouds. Others, of feathers falling in rhythm. Some, of nothing at all, only the sound of breathing beside a loved one. Even the stray dogs slept curled tight, tails flicking to an invisible tempo, and Bell Hollow breathed together, like a single, resting heart. The bell rings. Time returns not as a command, but as a song. The village listens, and the hush glows. Morning came slowly. The clouds parted like silk, drawn back by a patient hand, and for the first time in many seasons, the sunlight touched the tower's face. Just as the pendulum swung through its center, the hands moved again, tick, 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 each second as soft as a feather falling through fog. Aurelian stood at the base of the tower, his small box open before him. Inside, only one item remained untouched, a key, not of iron, not of brass, but a quiet, worn silver, its edges smoothed by time and many gentle hands. He lifted it with care, no urgency, no ceremony, just presence, as if he were about to unlock not a machine, but a memory. He climbed the stairs, slowly, each creak of the wood beneath him echoed like a heartbeat. He passed the gears, now humming with quiet certainty, passed the bell rope, now taut and ready, and reached the face of the mechanism. The chime system rested behind a small locked panel. One twist of the key, and the hours would flow again. Not in noise, not in domination, but in rhythm, in breath, in hush. He placed the key into the slot, paused, whispered, "Only if you are willing," and turned it. Click. Not loud, not sharp. Just the sound of readiness returning. And below, in the square, Isolde looked up from her knitting and closed her eyes. "Now," she whispered. The clock hands aligned, the pendulum paused, inhaled, and then, from deep within the tower, the bell sang. It was not like the chimes of great cities, not shrill, not commanding. It was low, warm, resonant. It rolled through the village, like fog through a valley, slow and embracing. It passed through shutters, through chimneys, through the folds of blankets. It passed into dreams and out again like a lullaby. Returning to the mouth that first sang it, people stopped moving, not in fear, not in confusion, but in reverence, as if someone had called their name in a voice they had not heard since childhood. One chime, 2, 3. The bell sang 10 times, then 11, and at the 12th chime, something beautiful happened, not in the clock, not in the tower, but in them. The baker wept into his apron, not from sadness, but from memory. The blacksmith took off his gloves and placed his hands on the earth. The seamstress kissed the patch stitched onto her wrist, and the children, for just a moment, went utterly still, listening, eyes wide, breath held. Then someone began to hum, a tune, old as moss, simple as warmth, and soon others joined. Not to perform, just to be part of it. The hush did not, and it changed. It grew louder without noise. It filled spaces without taking room. It became part of every glance, every smile, every pause between words. Aurelian descended the tower stairs, his box empty, his hands loose. He stepped into the square, and the people, the quiet, listening people of Bell Hollow, bowed their heads, not to him, but to the moment. Isolde reached out, took his hand, pressed something into his palm, a tiny ring, made of thread and time. "For the road," she said. He nodded, but did not leave. Not yet, because sometimes, after the bell has rung, you must sit quietly and feel what the sound left behind. The village breathes into the rhythm, and time becomes not something they serve, but something they share. After the 12th chime, no one spoke, not at first. Words had no place in the space that followed. Only breath, only warmth, only being. It was Isolde who broke the silence, not with speech, but with a soft clearing of her throat and the beginning of a hum. Not a song, not a hymn, just a sound. Low, round, comforting. Others joined in, some with voices, some with steps, some by closing their eyes and letting the hum move through them like a breeze between trees. That morning, time did not rush forward. It did not scold or demand. It settled like a warm stone in your pocket. The villagers began to tell time differently, not by minutes, not by bells. But by moments. The baker called his first batch the loaf of light, because it always came out golden. Just after sunrise, the schoolmistress began her lessons with something she called bell breathing, 3 slow inhales, to the rhythm of the pendulum swing. And the children, they started naming hours, not with numbers, but with feeling. This is the hour of lavender. This is the time of squirrel shadows. This is the moment of the first yawn. And no one corrected them, because they were right. Aurelian spent less time inside the tower now, not because his work was done, but because the tower needed space to be. He would walk the village instead, checking window hinges, listening to the sound of wooden carts, pausing to watch how shadows moved across cobblestones. He was listening for time in the world, not just a clock. Isolde often joined him. Their conversations were short, their silences were long. They would sit by the orchard, watching bees bob between blossoms, and she would say things like, "I once saw the bell ring in fog so thick, we heard it before we found our feet." And Aurelian would smile, because Memory, too, is a kind of time. One afternoon, the children asked Aurelian if the bell could chime again. He looked up at the tower and asked, "What for?" They blinked, shrugged. "For the joy of it," said one. "Because it's lovely," said another. "Because some of us were asleep the first time," said the littlest one. And Aurelian nodded. That evening, just as the sky turned to peach and violet, the bell chimed once. Only once, and it was enough. A woman in the bakery put down her flour scoop and cried softly into her apron, not because she was sad, but because the bell had reached a part of her she did not know was still listening. After that, the bell did not ring on the hour. It rang when it was needed, sometimes at noon, sometimes at dusk. Once at midnight, when a baby was born, it chimed for weddings, for returns, for reconciliations, for beginnings. People stopped measuring their lives by the ticking of minutes. Instead, they spoke in stories. I met him too, chimes before the cider festival. She left the morning after the bell sang in the rain. They forgave each other at the hour of the golden leaves. And so the hush remained, not as silence, not as absence, but as something that wrapped the village in calm presence. Even the animals seemed to sense it. Cats lounged longer in sunbeams. Horses stepped more softly. Birds nested near the tower windows, as if they, too, were drawn to its quiet song. Aurelian would sometimes rest beside the tower, his back against a stone, his fingers tracing circles in the dust. He looked not at clocks but at people, and he saw what time had become: a gift, not a burden, a candle, not a chain. And above, the tower stood tall, its face no longer blank, its hands no longer stiff, its pendulum no longer uncertain. It had returned not to rule time, but to share it. The tower whispers its oldest memory, and Aurelian begins to listen to the time that came before. The bell no longer rang to command, it rang to remind. And yet, on a certain silver morning, before the village awoke, Aurelian was already in the tower. Not to adjust, not to repair, not to polish, but to listen. He sat beside the base of the main gear housing, a small oil lamp flickering nearby, casting soft, round shadows on the stone wall. The pendulum ticked gently above him. Tick, 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 but beneath it, beneath the hum of time returning, was something else. A softer sound, not mechanical, not new. A voice. No, not a voice, a memory. He closed his eyes, let his fingertips trail lightly along the stone floor, then the iron shaft of the gear column. It was warm, not with heat, but with history. And then, almost like breath behind the ears, it came a whisper, faint, like wind, tracing the edge of a scroll. Not the first chime. The words did not alarm him. They were not outside him, nor entirely within. They belonged to the hush of the tower itself. Aurelian had heard echoes like this only once before. Years ago in a cathedral tower, built upon Roman ruins. There, too, the stones had murmured, stories sealed in mortar, secrets trapped in silence. And now, Bell Hollow's clock tower was ready to share its own. He lit another lamp, not brighter, but deeper. Its light was amber, dull and calm, just enough to feel one's way through memory. He reached behind the winding drum, where an older, unused gear sat. He had never touched this one. It was not part of the current system. It seemed decorative until now. As his hand settled on it, the whisper returned. Not the first chime, but the last. Aurelian froze, not in fear, but in reverence. This gear, this forgotten piece of brass and silence, was ancient. Older than the bell. Older, perhaps, than the village itself. He traced the rim of the gear with a soft cloth, revealing a series of notches, not evenly spaced, not practical, symbolic, etched in a circular script he had only seen once before, in an alchemist's book bound in lead leaf and starlight. He copied the symbols onto parchment, each stroke of his pen slow, as though writing in sleep. And as he wrote, his heartbeat matched the tick of the pendulum. Back, forth, steady. The script read more like music than words, phrases shaped in rhythm, echoes hidden in lines, but one phrase stood out, a cluster of marks in the shape of a blooming spiral. Aurelian whispered it aloud. The hour that was promised. The gears around him ticked slightly louder, then settled. The whisper vanished. Outside, the morning fog had thickened. The villagers stirred, but did not wake fully. Time seemed to slow, just slightly. Aurelian descended the tower with the parchment in hand. He found Isolde resting on a bench near the linden trees. She was humming an old tune about candlelight and drifting snow. He sat beside her, handed her the paper. She studied it, tilted her head. "My mother used to hum this pattern," she said quietly. "She said it was from before the tower even had hands." Aurelian looked at the gear marks again. "The hour that was promised," he repeated. Isolde nodded slowly. "They used to say the tower would one day remember a song that no one alive had ever heard. A 13th chime," she whispered. Aurelian looked up at the tower. It stood still, peaceful, innocent, but something old rested inside it still, waiting, not ominously, not darkly, just patiently. He returned to the mechanism room, knelt before the silent gear. This was no ordinary part. It was not broken. It was waiting to be asked, and Aurelian, who had never rushed a gear in his life, did not touch it, not yet. Instead, he placed his open palm upon it, closed his eyes, and whispered, "When you are ready, we will find the 13th hour together." The 13th chime begins to reveal itself through dreams, memories, and the silence between seconds. The village of Bell Hollow continued on in its new rhythm. People no longer asked for the time. They felt it in the way the butter cooled, in the way the candle leaned, in the way the shadows stretched when stories were told near the linden tree. And yet, something stirred beneath the calm. Not unrest, not fear, not curiosity, not a deep, drowsy kind. The kind that rises after a dream you almost remember. The children felt it first. They began waking in the middle of the night, with silver dreams they could not fully explain. Dreams of a bell that rang not 12, but 13 times. Dreams of a soft wind that sang in circles, wrapping the village in warmth, like a woolen spell. One child, Lyra, approached Aurelian at dawn. She held out a bundle of lavender stalks, tied with a string. "For the hour that is not on the clock," she whispered, and he smiled. Children often knew what grown-ups had forgotten. That day, Aurelian sat beside the silent gear, the one etched with ancient symbols. He no longer tried to translate. He listened instead, and in that stillness, he began to understand. The 13th hour was never meant to follow the 12th. It was not a time you reached. It was a time you remembered. He began to notice strange patterns. The pendulum ticked slightly softer whenever the wind blew from the west. The gear housing whispered, faintly just before the sun disappeared. And the chime rope swayed when no hand had touched it, only during moments of stillness, when someone in the village was thinking of someone else with love. He kept a small book of these noticings, not facts, not rules, but hushes. Hush, when the robin sings before storm. Hush, when two people forgive each other. Hush, when a story is told with trembling hands. It became clear. The 13th chime was not a bell at all. It was a feeling it rang when hearts aligned. It sounded when presence was so strong it could not be held in silence. Isolde, too, had begun to feel it. She spoke less, sat longer, hummed in unfamiliar tones. Once, while mending an old shawl, she looked up and said, "The 13th hour is where time stops, but love continues." Aurelian wrote it down, then underlined it twice, *at dusk. He climbed the tower and lit the small amber lamp once more. The gear remained untouched. He knelt before it and whispered, "I do not ask to use you, only to understand you." And the wind shifted, ever so slightly. In the village, a man found an old letter in a drawer he thought was empty. He read it 3 times, then folded it and pressed it to his chest. He did not cry. He just breathed, and in the tower, the silent gear turned just once. That night, Lyra woke again from a dream. She told her mother. The bell rang 13 times, but the sound was soft like snow. Her mother kissed her forehead. Then, it was not a bell, she said. It was a blessing. The villagers began to speak of the hush as if it were a person. They said it visited them while stirring soup, while brushing hair, while walking beside someone without needing to speak. Aurelian sat beneath the stars with the old book of hushes in his lap. He looked at the tower, the gear, the village, and he knew. The 13th chime would not come from the bell, it would come from the people. Not in a sound, but in a moment. Shared, a moment remembered, a moment lived so fully it echoed forever. The village approaches the 13th hour, not through clocks, but through kindness, memory, and presence. It happened slowly, so slowly, in fact, that no one realized they were preparing for something sacred. They baked bread a little earlier, hung their lanterns a little longer, touched each other's shoulders with a little more gentleness, and in between those gentle things, those in-between moments that no calendar marks, the village of Bell Hollow slid quietly into something ancient. Not a ritual, not a festival, but a remembrance of something they did not know they had forgotten. It began one evening when a potter's hands slipped while shaping a bowl. The clay fell. The rim cracked, and she nearly wept, but instead of throwing it out, she held it, pressed the pieces together, and whispered, "You are still whole." The next morning, that cracked bowl sat in the village square, filled with petals, no sign, no explanation. But everyone who passed it felt something slow and warm rise inside them. That same day, a traveling fiddler arrived in the village. He did not speak much, only nodded with a soft smile. He stood by the linden trees and played a tune, so slow it felt like honey pouring from wood. People gathered, not to dance, not to cheer, but simply to listen. They closed their eyes, held hands, and time stood still. Later that night, the fiddler slept beneath the stars beside the tower, and in his sleep, he smiled. Inside the tower, the silent gear turned again, just once, soft as breath. Aurelian stood beside the clock face. He watched the moon move slowly through a layer of clouds, and he felt something inside his chest tick with a rhythm not his own. He placed his palm against the stones and whispered, "It is almost here, is it not?" The stones gave no reply, but they did not need to. All around the village, things were being made with no purpose but love. A scarf left on a doorstep, a basket of blackberries with no name tied to it, a poem carved into the bark of an old tree. 6 words only. You made the quiet feel warm. No one planned it, no one declared it, but Bell Hollow was becoming the 13th chime. Isolde noticed it first. She stopped by Aurelian's bench one morning, her shawl heavy with dew. "We are moving without moving," she said. "The people are ringing, not the bell." Aurelian nodded. "Yes," he said, "and they do not even know." That night, something changed in the wind. It slowed, curled, paused between trees as though waiting. A robin sang at dusk, not its usual trill, but something lower, rounder. The children stopped playing to listen. Inside the bakery, the oven clicked, without flame, and the baker, half asleep, felt as though someone had touched his shoulder and said, "You are part of it." He did not know what it was, but he wept anyway. Aurelian stood in the tower. The pendulum swayed. The bell rope was still, and the hush was the deepest it had ever been. Not empty, not waiting, full. He whispered to the silent gear. They had become the chime, and the gear did not move, because it did not need to. It was already speaking in the silence. The 13th chime arrives not with sound, but with presence, a moment so quiet, it echoes forever. The village did not know what day it was, not by date, not by count, not by calendar, but they felt it. Something quiet had ripened in the air, like fruit just before it falls, like breath just before it speaks. The bell tower stood taller, somehow, not by height, but by meaning. Its presence stretched farther, its hush reached deeper. Even those in cottages farthest from the square found themselves lighting candles without reason, sitting beside windows, looking not at time, but for something. Children spoke less. They drew circles in the dirt, braided grasses together, laughed without sound. And one by one, without being asked, they brought their toys to the base of the tower and laid them in a ring, not as offerings, but as gifts of stillness. At midday, a soft fog returned to Bell Hollow. Not cold, not wet, just thick enough to make the world feel wrapped in cotton. Lanterns glowed a little warmer. Doors creaked a little slower. And somewhere, deep in the hush, a moment unfolded. Aurelian was in the tower, his hands resting on his knees, his breath slow and steady. He had not touched a mechanism that day. He had not polished, or wound, or adjusted. He had only listened. And now, he closed his eyes. Outside, in the square, a woman sat down beside a man she had not spoken to in 3 years. Their eyes met, and that was enough. 2 children. Previously, strangers held hands and watched the fog swallow the edge of the bakery. They did not speak, but their fingers stayed laced. The baker placed one perfect loaf on the windowsill and did not ring the bell for customers. He simply waited and smiled. In the linden grove, Isolde held a small lantern in her lap and hummed something with no melody, no structure, no end, and still. It soothed all around the village. People paused, not because they were told, not because they were waiting, but because they knew. The 13th hour had arrived. And then, in every house, every corner, every hand, the feeling came, a hush deeper than silence, a warmth beyond touch, a knowing without words. Time slowed, then folded, then disappeared. The bell did not ring, the gears did not turn, the pendulum paused, and yet, the moment rang louder than any chime the tower had ever known. It was not marked in sound, it was marked in stillness, in presence, in heartbeats shared, in breath held, and released together. It lasted only a few seconds, but it lived forever, in the folds of memory. Later, when asked what they had felt, the villagers gave no answers, only tears, only smiles, only the soft grasping of hands. They said, it was like time took a breath with us. Aurelian descended the tower slowly. His eyes were misted, his steps were sure. At the base, he found the ring of toys, the lanterns, the flowers. He said nothing, only knelt and touched the earth. Isolde arrived, her steps light as wind. She sat beside him, took his hand, and whispered, "You brought back the hour we did not know we needed." He shook his head. "No," he replied. "You remembered it on your own." Above them, the bell remained still. The pendulum rested, and for the first time in 100 years, the tower slept. Not from disrepair, not from sorrow, but from peace. And the stillness after the 13th chime. The village begins to live more slowly, more gently, and more truly. The next morning, Bell Hollow woke slowly. There were no rooster calls, no bells, no ticking hands, only the rustle of morning breeze through curtains left open, and the scent of ash cooling in hearths that had glowed late into the night. Aurelian remained in bed longer than usual, not in tiredness, not in reluctance, but in reverence. His hands rested over his chest, his breath like the soft swinging of a pendulum in a tower that no longer needed to speak. All across the village, people moved gently. The blacksmith opened his shutters, then closed them again too. Listen to the silence. The schoolmistress let the children stay outside the whole morning without instruction, watching birds build nests and tracing sunbeams in the dust. The 13th hour had not ended. It had simply spread, not forward, but inward. People began speaking in softer tones, laughing less loudly, not from sadness, but from a feeling that peace itself was listening. Old routines were altered. The seamstress left her door unlocked. The baker set loaves on the windowsill, with no price tags. Neighbors passed each other, not with words, but with small bows, gentle smiles, a hand pressed to the heart. Children, ever sensitive to unseen rhythms, made up new games. They whispered stories about the 13th hour, some true, some imagined, all beautiful. They called the hush a spirit, a candle with no flame, a bell that rings in dreams. One child, a boy named Elias, brought a glass jar to the tower steps. Inside, a single dandelion seed. He placed it there with no explanation. Aurelian, upon finding it, whispered, "Even the smallest hush deserves to be honored." The silent gear remained unmoving, but its stillness felt complete, not dormant, not waiting, just fulfilled. Aurelian spent his days, now wandering slowly through the village. He measured time by scent and sound. The hour of warm bread, for the moment of two crows calling at once, the silence that fell just before a friend knocked gently on a door. He kept his small, leather journal, the book of hushes, and added to it daily, the way Isolde pauses before turning the page. The hush after a long-held breath. The moment the last ember gives its glow. He noticed the people began doing this to not writing, but witnessing. A nod here, a longer look there, a hand reaching to still a wobbling chair before it could fall. Time had become something sacred again, not something to chase, but something to tend. Isolde sat beneath the linden tree most days now. People visited her, not with questions, but with presence. They brought warm tea, short stories, unfinished thoughts. And she listened, not always with ears, but with heart. She once told a child, "Every time you slow down enough to feel the wind, you're letting the 13th chime ring again." The child blinked, nodded, and ran off to sit in the middle of the garden path for a full 5 minutes, doing absolutely nothing. It was glorious. Soon, a quiet tradition began. People would gather without invitation in the square. No schedule, no speech, just a few moments of stillness together. They called it sharing the 13. Aurelian often watched from the tower steps. He would close his eyes and let their hush wrap around him like soft wool. He knew now that the bell might never need to ring again, because the people were ringing instead. And each time someone gave an unspoken kindness, each time a child paused just to watch a moth land on a windowsill, the tower felt it, not in gears, not in bells, but in stone, in stillness, in soul. Asterisk, a stranger arrives with forgotten knowledge, and the hush deepens into history. The fog returned to Bell Hollow on the 7th day after the 13th hour. Soft, silver, warm, it moved slowly between the rooftops, weaving itself into chimneys, sliding over the river like memory made visible. Aurelian woke before dawn. He had not planned to, but the hush had asked him, not with words, not even with sound, but with a pull, like a thread of silk tugged gently from the heart. He rose, wrapped himself in wool, and stepped barefoot onto the tower's cold floor. The pendulum swayed softly. The gears were still, and the sky beyond. The windows was the color of milk mixed with smoke. He descended the tower stairs and stepped outside into the breathless morning. That was when he saw her. She stood near the linden tree, a small figure, cloaked, motionless, not waiting, not arriving, simply present. She held nothing in her hands, but at her feet lay a box, small, carved, ancient, the kind of box that remembered things even people forgot. Aurelian approached without speaking. He bowed his head gently. She nodded in return. Then, as if placing a feather on a nest of leaves, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in folds of velvet dark as candle smoke, was a gear, not brass, not steel, but wood. Polished and warm. Knelt beside it, traced its teeth, counted the spokes, saw the same spiral marks he had seen on the hidden gear within the tower. He looked up at her. This was the first. She nodded once. Her voice came like a sigh through pine needles. Before the tower, before the bell, there was only the hush. Aurelian touched a wooden gear again. It hummed, not with sound, but with memory. He closed his eyes and was filled with images. Children tying bells to tree branches to catch windsong. Villagers weaving time into braids and prayers. A tall stone tower being raised, not to mark the hours, but to honor the silence between them. He opened his eyes, tears softening his lashes. The hush came first. She smiled. The hush is first. Then she placed one more object in the box, a feather no larger than a baby's smile, painted with silver ink in a looping script. Let no bell ring louder than love. She bowed again, turned, and walked slowly into the thickening mist. She left no name, no destination, only the box. In the hush that followed her, Aurelian stood in the square for a long time. Villagers began to stir. A shutter creaked open. A dog stretched in the doorway, and still, he held the box close, tender as if it held not history, but home. He placed it inside the tower, set it beside the silent gear, and lit a single candle to burn beside it through the day. That afternoon, Isolde visited. She ran her fingers along the box's edge and smiled softly. "I remember stories about this," she whispered. "Stories my grandmother called the hush before the world." She opened her shawl and pulled from it a length of worn lace, embroidered with spirals in the same pattern as the gear. "They stitched this for the day the hush would return." She placed it at the base of the pendulum housing, and for a moment, even the ticking paused. Outside, the children danced in slow circles. Not for celebration, not for games, just because something inside them was swaying. And above them all, the bell remained quiet. The wind, still. But the hush grew deeper, and the tower, for the first time in its long life, remembered. The village begins living in harmony, with the hush blending its stillness into their daily rhythms, letting love and quiet guide their days. The hush did not fade, it lingered, like the scent of lavender after the stems had been gathered, like the warmth of a fire after the embers had gone to sleep. It was in the corners of rooms, in the pauses between words, in the way hands touched hands just a little longer. Life in Bell Hollow did not stop. It slowed, but not from weariness, from wonder. People began keeping hush journals, not diaries, not schedules, just lists, little notes, small recordings of stillness. One farmer wrote, "The wind made the wheat bow in waves today. It sounded like a sigh. I sat in the soil and let it pass through me." A young girl scribbled, "I held a moth in my hand until it decided to leave. That was the most beautiful thing I did all week." A widow, living at the edge of the woods, wrote, "I did not speak today, not because I had no one to talk to, but because the silence was enough company." The hush had become a kind of compass. It pointed not to places, but to presence. Even the tower changed, not in shape, not in structure, but in feeling. It no longer stood as a monument to time. It became a sanctuary of stillness. People would sit at its base, some in groups, some alone. They would breathe, think, listen, Aurelian. Placed a small wooden sign near the entrance. "Please enter quietly. The hush is resting." It made people smile, and so they obeyed. Inside the tower, Aurelian added a small table beside the old gear and velvet box. He called it the Table of Remembering. Upon it, villagers left a dried sprig of mint, a button from a grandfather's coat, a page from a storybook, a thimble, a shell. None labeled, none explained, only felt. Children were the ones who gave the tower a new name, not officially, not in writing, but in whispers. The listening tower. Because they said they could feel it, listening. To dreams, to kindness, to the footsteps of mice in the rafters at night. Even the animals changed. Dogs barked less, cats purred more. Birds began singing in rounds, soft trills that echoed each other like lullabies, chasing their own tails. One day, a man visiting from another village asked, "But how do you know the time?" The baker, dusting flour from his hands, replied, "We do not know it, we feel it." And he offered the man a slice of warm bread with lavender honey. No charge, no reason, just a hush shared. Time in Bell Hollow was now marked by rituals. The candle hour, just before twilight, when everyone lit a small flame and whispered something they were grateful for. The pause of bread, just after midday, when workers and weavers sat and simply breathed. The slow sweep, at dusk, when brooms touched floors, not to clean, but to bless. Each movement gentle, each gesture slow, each moment honored. His Elda began teaching something called quiet mending. She showed how to stitch not just cloth, but memory. Patch your shirt where the laughter spilled. Reinforce the sleeve where you were hugged too tight. And people came to her, not with torn fabric, but with softened hearts. And Aurelian, he smiled more now. He walked without shoes. He began waking not to alarms, but to birdsong and the scent of the earth warming. He touched the tower only to thank it, not to fix. He began each day with a simple whisper, "Let me move at the speed of kindness." And the village moved with him. They did not need the 13th chime to sound again, because they had become it, living, each breath, in quiet rhythm. With the hush. Asterisk, the village uncovers a forgotten journal, written by the tower's original builder, and the hush reaches back through the centuries to complete its circle. It began with a sound, not a bell, not a chime, a creak. Soft, slow, like an old breath rising from beneath the floorboards. Aurelian had been sitting beside the gear, his hands wrapped around a cup of steeped thyme, when the stone just beneath his right foot shifted, only slightly. But enough. He set the cup aside. Kneeling, he brushed away a thin layer of dust and found a seam, a small crack in the stone tile that had not been there before. He pressed gently. It sank downward with a patient sigh, and beneath it was a compartment. Wrapped in linen, the color of quiet snow, was a book, or rather, a journal. The leather was cracked, the spine worn smooth. And embossed faintly on the cover was a symbol, a spiral surrounding a small sleeping bell. He carried it outside to the square, sat beneath the linden tree, and opened it. The first page held only a name, Oren of the Hollow. Aurelian inhaled slowly. He had heard that name only once before, in a faded stone carving, nearly worn smooth by time. Oren, the first builder, the one who had listened the tower into being. The writing was elegant, but simple, like a quiet voice meant only for moonlight. "Today, I lay the first stone, not for a tower that counts time, but for one that honors it. The people do not yet understand, but they feel the hush in their bones. I have dreamed of a bell that does not ring with sound, but with stillness." Each entry was a window. Each page, a breath. Oren wrote of shaping wood with reverence, of forging gears from salvaged ship iron so they would remember the sea's rhythm. He wrote of measuring time by the length of a story, by the curve of laughter, by the silence after a goodbye. One passage was circled, "I am not building a clock. I am building a companion for those who wish to walk beside time, not behind it." Aurelian felt the weight of those words settle over his shoulders like a soft shawl. He read on, "I have placed a wooden gear carved with the spiral of breath beneath the foundation. It will not turn with the others. It will turn only when the village remembers stillness." Aurelian looked up, eyes wide. That was the very gear discovered weeks ago, the one nestled in velvet, carried by the silent visitor. The first piece. He flipped further, toward the final entries. "The bell is hung. It has not rung. I believe it should not until the village is ready to hear silence as music. Then, a final note. I will leave this book beneath the stone, closest to the sunrise. Let the one who finds it be a listener, not a repairer. And let them know, the 13th hour is not something built. It is something remembered." Aurelian closed the journal. His hands trembled. Not from fear, not from cold, from awe. He stood, walked quietly to the square, held the journal up to the people gathered there. They had come slowly, one by one, drawn not by curiosity, but by pull, the same gentle thread that had woken Aurelian that morning. He read aloud only one line, "I am not building a clock." The villagers completed it, as if they had always known, but a companion, and the hush bloomed. They gathered in a circle, not speaking, just being. The journal passed from hand to hand, each person holding it briefly, then placing it gently in the lap of the next. Children traced a spiral on its cover. Old ones held it close to their chests. One woman closed her eyes and whispered, "We have been walking beside time all along." That evening, the journal was returned to its place inside the tower, not buried, but welcomed, set upon the table of remembering, wrapped in the lace Isilda had once given, and beside it, Aurelian placed a new page, his own writing. "We heard you, Oren, and now we listen together. The village prepares for its first ever celebration of stillness, the soft gathering. It was Isilda who first whispered the idea. Not loudly, not too many just to Aurelian, beneath the linden tree, as dusk curled around their shoulders. We should gather, she said. Not to shout, not to cheer, but to thank. And the hush seemed to nod. They did not call it a festival. That word was too sharp, too bright. They called it simply the soft gathering. There would be no fireworks, no trumpets, no clock to start it, no bell to end it. Only candles, whispers, and offerings of stillness. Children began preparing first. They crafted paper lanterns with soft glowing paint made from crushed berries and moon milk, some shaped like spirals, some like feathers, one shaped like a sleeping cat. The schoolmistress offered her field for the gathering, a wide-open meadow just beyond the stream, where sunflowers used to bloom and the grass sang when the wind passed through. People were invited not with flyers, but with gestures. A hand over the heart, a small spiral drawn in the palm, a glance toward the sky just after dusk. Each home prepared a hush offering, a story whispered between generations, a hand-woven pouch of dried time, a stone smoothed by pocket warmth. None were labeled, none were judged, only shared. Aurelian prepared nothing elaborate. He took only the small wooden gear from the velvet-lined box, wrapped it gently in the lace Isilda had gifted, and tied it with a single thread from his old clockmaker's coat. He placed it in a satchel and let it rest. He would know when to present it. The evening of the soft gathering arrived without announcement. The sky turned to that shade of blue that exists only between breath and dream. One by one, villagers made their way to the field, some in pairs, some alone, but all walking at the same pace. Children carried their lanterns, cupping them in small, reverent hands. They glowed like bottled dusk, soft, gentle orbs that breathed light instead of blazing it. No one brought chairs. They sat on woven blankets, on baskets turned sideways, on grass that welcomed their weight like a memory returning. There was no stage, no speaker, only a wide open space in the center of the meadow, outlined with gathered feathers. They called it the circle of listening. Within it, anyone could enter, not to perform, but to share. A song hummed in half-voice, a poem remembered only in part, a silence held with courage. Each offering was met with warmth, not claps, not praise, just eyes that stayed, and hearts that softened. Isilda entered the circle with a kettle of lavender tea and poured it into 7 wooden cups, placed gently on the grass. She did not speak, but one by one, those cups were lifted, sipped, returned. It was her lullaby too. The evening, Aurelian stepped forward. He did not say his name, only held the small wooden gear for all to see. This, he whispered, was the first. It never turned with the others. It waited for you. He placed it in the center of the circle, unwrapped, the lace folded beside it, the thread fluttering in the evening breeze. A child followed, placing beside the gear a tiny clay bowl. Inside, a single grain of rice and somehow it felt perfect. The hush thickened, not like fog, but like velvet. Every breath was synchronized, every heart unhurried. And then, without plan, 100 voices hummed together, not in harmony, not in rhythm, but in feeling. A chord not found in music, a resonance born of peace. The lanterns flickered, the gear gleamed, and Bell Hollow exhaled together. The gathering ended, not when the crowd dispersed, but when they slept, right there in the field, on each other's shoulders. Under wool blankets and silence, the stars blinked softly above. Even they kept quiet. Aurelian, filled with the softness of the gathering, writes his final message in the Hush Journal, connecting all who came before and all who will come after. The morning after the soft gathering was unlike any other, not because of a grand celebration, or fanfare, or noise, but because of the way the village moved. People awoke without rush. Blankets were folded with tenderness. The field was left as it had been found, quiet, whole, full of new memory. Even the birds sang softer, as if they had been part of the circle, and now carried the hush in their wings. Aurelian stood beside the linden tree, in one hand, a fresh page of parchment, in the other, his grandmother's pen, kept safe all these years in a drawer lined with felt. He walked slowly to the listening tower. The pendulum greeted him with a sleepy sway, the gears, still warm from holding centuries of quiet, and the hushed journal, resting on the table of remembering, awaited his hand. He opened it, passed over Oren's earliest words, the spirals, the smudges, the breathings of time, until he reached the last blank page. He let his hand hover, felt the moment settle, then began to write. To those who find this journal, whether tomorrow or long after my shadow has faded, the 13th chime is not a sound, it is not counted, it is not rung, it is remembered. I once thought I was here to repair this tower, to win what had wound down, to make time move again, but now I understand. The tower did not stop because it was broken. It paused because it was waiting for you, for us, to stop measuring time and start feeling it. He paused, dipped the pen again. The ink, like midnight water in a well of moonlight. Oren built this place to honor the quiet, not the silence of emptiness, but the fullness found in a single breath shared between souls. We have remembered that hush now. We have lived it, and in doing so, we became the bell. May you who read this continue the stillness, not by doing less, but by being more gentle, more aware, more rooted in presence than in pursuit. He signed his name, simply, Aurelian, of the listening tower. Then beneath it, in smaller script, and all who sat in the field under the lanterns of hush, he let the ink dry, pressed the page closed, and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." The journal was returned to the shelf with no ceremony. But that night, Isolde placed a single almond blossom on the table beside it, and somehow, it felt like applause. The next day, the journal was joined by other offerings, a painted stone, folded note, with no words, just a drawn spiral. A clock hand, detached from its machine, laid gently on a bed of wool. Children added to it too. One placed a feather, another, a piece of licorice root, and one small boy left the first tooth he had ever lost. He told his mother, "I want the tower to remember me, even when I am big." She kissed his cheek and said, "It already does." The hush journal was not read aloud again. It did not need to be. Its words had settled into the walls, into the trees, into the way people now paused before speaking. The hush had become habit, and Aurelian, he returned to his watchmaker's bench, not to fix, but to feel. He began making watches that did not tell the hour, only the heartbeat, worn over the heart. They ticked only when the wearer paused long enough to listen. He gave them freely, each one inscribed on the back, "You are the 13th chime." A quiet stranger arrives in Bell Hollow, seeking something he has no name for. But here, in a village shaped by stillness, he begins to remember what he had forgotten. The road to Bell Hollow was not marked on most maps. The paths twisted gently, through mossy woods, crossed whispering brooks, and past trees whose branches seemed to point the way, not with direction, but with welcome. On a morning wrapped in silver mist, a man arrived, not hurried, but heavy. His coat was fine, but wrinkled. His shoes, polished, yet tired. His eyes were sharp, like clock hands that had ticked too long without pause. He carried no pack, only a book, half filled with numbers and goals and lists, and on the cover, stamped in gold, efficiency and success, a daily system. He reached the edge of the village just as the fog lifted and paused, because something in the air stilled him. A woman passed him, pushing a cart filled with herbs. She did not rush, she did not smile, but she looked at him, nodded slowly, and said, "You are right on time," then continued on. The man frowned, checked his watch, no hands, just a black screen, dot. It had stopped. He tapped it once, twice, nothing. He stepped farther, into the village. Everything moved as if underwater. Children gliding on wooden stilts, a dog sleeping in the center of the path, a man whittling without ever looking up. The man tried to speak, to ask where the inn was, or if there was a carriage schedule. But each time, the words stuck, not out of fear, but because no one else was. Speaking, he reached the square, saw the tower, felt something shift in his chest, a slow turning, like a key inside a lock that had not been touched in years. Aurelian stood outside, rubbing oil into a wooden gear the size of a dinner plate. He looked up, met the man's eyes. "Welcome," he said softly. "You look like someone who has been keeping time for too long." The man blinked, opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded. Aurelian gestured toward the bench beneath the linden tree. They sat, no introductions, just breath and birdsong, and the tower casting a long, kind shadow. After a while, the man spoke. "I do not know what I am looking for." Aurelian nodded. "Good. That means you might actually find it." They sat in silence. The breeze moved through the leaves like someone softly turning pages. The man closed his eyes, let his shoulders drop, and when he opened them again, a small child had placed a warm stone in his lap. No explanation, just a gift of weight. He smiled faintly, but it was the first smile he had worn in months later. Isolde brought tea, chamomile, with a single blackberry floating inside. "Drink slowly," she said. "It is not meant to be finished, only experienced." The man sipped. The taste was soft, but deep, and something inside him unwound. He stayed the night in a small cottage, owned by no one but always open. He lit a candle, wrote nothing, slept without dreaming, and woke with tears on his cheek. The next morning, he returned to the tower. Aurelian was already there, guiding a group of children through the art of quiet polishing. He handed the man a cloth, no words, just motion, together. They cleaned the old brass face of a clock that no longer ticked. Each sweep was a breath, each pause a kind of prayer. When it was done, Aurelian placed a small book in the man's hands. Not the hush journal, not a manual, just a blank notebook tied with thread. Inside the cover, for the thoughts you never gave yourself time to hear. The man sat alone beneath the tree, opened the first page, and wrote, "I forgot how to be. But today, I remembered how to stop." And for the first time in a very, very long while, he did not look at his watch, because the hush was telling time for him. A distant village sends a letter to Bell Hollow, asking for guidance on embracing stillness, and the hush begins to travel. The letter arrived on a day when the sky was the color of unpolished silver. It was carried not by messenger, but by a farmer passing through. He had no grand story to tell of its origins, only that someone far away had said, "This belongs in the tower." Aurelian unfolded the parchment carefully. The ink was dark and deliberate. Each word seemed to weigh itself before being written. Letter read, "To those who keep the Tower of Silence, we are a village far from yours, though not so far that we have not heard whispers of the hush. They say your bells do not ring, but your hearts do. That time moves differently there, not as a taskmaster, but as a companion. We are afraid of stillness here. It feels like emptiness. It feels like waiting for something we do not want to face. But perhaps we are wrong. Perhaps the hush is not emptiness, but fullness we have not yet learned to hold. Will you teach us how to listen, how to stop, how to begin again without rushing forward? We will wait for your answer, even if it takes the time we cannot yet understand." With hope, the village of Stonekeep, Aurelian read the letter twice. Once with his eyes, once with his heart. By the time he finished, the linden tree had gathered a small crowd. Isolde touched the edge of the parchment, her fingers soft against its creases. "They are asking for something they already have," she whispered. "They just do not know how to see it yet." The hush journal was placed on the table of remembering that afternoon, open to a blank page. Each villager was invited to add a thought, a memory, a single word. The children called it a letter to the letter. One by one, the pages filled. A blacksmith wrote, "Start by touching something warm." A baker scribbled, "Let your bread rise twice as long." Not because it needs to, but because you do. A child drew a spiral. Another wrote, in uneven letters, Look at the stars, but don't count them. Aurelian added his own line. Begin by sitting where you can hear the wind, and let it tell you what to do next. The following morning, a satchel was prepared. Inside, the letter from Spoonkeep, the collective reply from Bell Hollow, a single feather tied to a piece of lace, and a small wooden gear carved by Aurelian himself. The satchel was entrusted to the same farmer who had brought the letter. He asked with a gentle smile, "What should I say when I hand it to them?" Aurelian replied, his voice low and steady, "Tell them the hush has already begun, and we are simply helping them to hear it." The farmer nodded and began his journey, his footsteps light. The village watched him go, then turned back to their quiet tasks, brooms sweeping, tea steeping, children tracing spirals in the dirt. Days passed, weeks, and though no reply had yet come, Bell Hollow knew the hush would find its way. It always did. One morning, the farmer returned. His eyes were brighter, his shoulders lighter. In his hands, a new letter, this time written on paper, thick as linen and folded with care. It read, "To the keepers of the listening tower, your gift arrived." As rain began to fall, soft and slow, as if to tell us we could take our time. We opened the satchel not with urgency, but with wonder. Each word you sent was read aloud. Each gift passed from hand to hand, and each of us sat in silence afterward, unsure what to do next. Then we realized that was the point, to sit, to wonder, to listen. The hush has begun here, as you said it would. We are learning to trust it. Thank you, not for the answers, but for the stillness that lets us find our own. With gratitude, the village of Spoonkeep. Aurelian smiled as he folded the letter, placed it beside the hush journal. Isilda brought a cup of tea, and together, they sat beneath the linden tree, watching the clouds drift slowly by. Somewhere, in a village not so far, the hush was spreading, and the 13th chime was beginning to echo. The villagers of Bell Hollow reflect on their journey and begin preparing to ensure the hush becomes a legacy, not just for their time, but for all time. The tower stood beneath a sky painted in soft shades of lavender and gold. The season had turned, but not hurriedly. Leaves fell not in torrents, but in gentle spirals, one by one, as if bowing to the earth they had nourished. Aurelian stood at the edge of the field, where the soft gathering had been held months earlier. The grass had grown lush again, soft as a woolen blanket. He turned toward the listening tower, its shadow long and kind. The bell hung still, but it seemed to hum faintly, as if catching the whispers that now lived in the village. Isilda approached, carrying a basket of lavender sprigs and a folded cloth of deep blue. "We should prepare something," she said, "not for ourselves, but for those who will find this place long after we are gone." Aurelian nodded. The idea felt right, not heavy, but light, like a pebble dropped into a well, not to disturb the water, but to measure its depth. The villagers gathered beneath the linden tree to discuss what they would leave behind, not as a monument, but as an invitation. One elder spoke softly, "The hush does not belong to us, we belong to it, and we should not try to keep it here. We should let it travel." Another suggested, "Perhaps we can plant something that grows slow but strong." And a child chimed in, "What if we write a song that no one sings aloud, only listens to in their heads?" The ideas drifted through the air like dandelion seeds, each one carrying a bit of hope, and in the end, they decided to leave behind 3 gifts, each one a quiet echo of the 13th chime. The first gift, Aurelian crafted a wooden box, lined with the same velvet that had once cradled the small wooden gear. Inside, they placed a page from the hush journal, written by Oren, a feather wrapped in lace, given by the children, a single sprig of dried lavender. The hush becomes part of the land, the people, and time itself. The tower stands not as a clock, but as a keeper of presence, guiding all who listen. The listening tower stood as it always had, but somehow it now seemed lighter, not in weight, in burden. It had been waiting for this for generations, to share its hush and watch it ripple outward. Now, it was no longer a lonely monument. It was a friend. The gear no longer turned, not because it was broken, because it did not need to. Its work was done. People still came to the tower. Visitors, travelers, the curious, but they left differently than they arrived. A little slower, a little softer, a little more aware of the space between words and the warmth between breaths. Aurelian aged gently, as if time had learned to be kinder to him. He still rose early, still polished things that did not shine, still wrote letters he did not send. And still, each morning, he stood in the doorway of the tower, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." Isolda's hair turned silver, but her eyes stayed bright. She became the village's soft historian, not of events, but of feelings. She taught the children how to hear rain, how to write lullabies without lyrics, how to mend clothing by telling it a story while you stitched. The linden trees around the gathering field grew tall. Birds nested in them. Children read beside them. And one day, a family arrived from far away just to sit in their shade. They brought no map, only a note. "Sit here. The hush will meet you." And it did. The hush no longer needed reminders. It lived in daily life, in the way bread was kneaded, in the way doors were opened slowly, in the way goodbyes were held a moment longer than absolutely necessary. The 13th chime was no longer a mystery. It was a rhythm, a choice, a remembering. One day, Aurelian took the hush journal from its resting place. He held it not like a record, but like a seed, and he handed it to a young girl with curious hands and kind eyes. She had once placed a painted feather on the table of remembering. Now, it was her turn to carry the hush forward. He said to her, "This is not a storybook. It is a listening book. And now, it listens to you." She did not answer. She only nodded, then opened it and began to add a drawing of a cloud that looked like a curled cat asleep. The hush continued, long after Aurelian's steps no longer echoed in the tower. Long after Isolda's stories were told only in dreamlight. Long after the bells were melted down and reshaped into spoons for newborns, and pendants for widows, and weights for poems that needed anchoring. And the tower, still there, still quiet, still listening, not watching time pass, but gently holding it. Sometimes, people still ask, "What is the 13th chime?" And someone always answers with a smile, a pause, or a whispered line. It is not a sound, it is a feeling. And so, if ever you find yourself moving too fast, counting too much, or chasing time like it is something you are missing, close your eyes, breathe, and listen. For the hush, for the stillness, for the 13th chime, which was never missing, only waiting.